What about these biologically diversified farming systems? What's the evidence that they improve ecosystem services relative to the chemically intensive monoculture farming systems? Well, we do have a lot of evidence for this, and myself and many others have done a huge amount of work, a huge literature review to bring together this information, and I can confidently say to you that the services that are important to farmers, which are the ones I showed on the diagram before, definitely these agroecological systems, these diversified farming systems, definitely produce a lot of these critical services important to farmers, and they also produce a lot of services that are perhaps not so critical for farmers, but are really important for the public, like biodiversity, habitat for biodiversity, improved water quality, reduced energy use, and carbon sequestration that can help with our climate change issues. So one of the questions that always comes up is, if you're going to have these agroecological farms, these diversified farms, and sure, they're better for the environment, but what about yield? Are they going to be reduced in yield? And is that going to be a problem? So I'd like to look first at a really old study, but still an important one. And this study looked at a large number of sustainable agricultural projects across 57 countries, and representing really a large number of farmers, 12 million farmers and 36 million hectares. And what they did was to compare resource conserving measures with unimproved, or in other words, mostly with subsistence farming. And the kinds of resource conserving practices they looked at were integrated pest management, agroforestry, aquaculture, livestock integration, integrated nutrient management, conservation tillage, and water harvesting. Okay, so these are a whole lot more techniques. Often these relate to the ones that I showed you earlier in the diversified farming diagram as being collections of several of those techniques that I mentioned. So agroforestry, for example, is going to incorporate tree species and understory crops at the same time, or other species in the understory. So that's like a form of intercropping in a way. So let's look at the data. In fact, in this study, they found pretty much across the board for many different crops that there was a significant improvement in yields when farmers took up some of these kinds of techniques. So they were getting better yields by also doing more sustainable practices. This study has definitely been critiqued extensively. There are two main criticisms. One is that some of the subjects, some of the studies were before-after studies that did not have a control, so other things could have been going on. There could have been other changes happening at the level of the country, economic changes or whatever, that could have caused what we see here. And the other critique is that these are farmers that had already adopted these techniques and had stuck with it and were successful. So it's not a random sample that might have included also farmers who took up the technique but then later abandoned it. So these are problems, but on the other hand, I think that it's pretty exciting that this can work. Perhaps not all farmers are, and certainly not all farmers are successful when they take up a new technique, but here's a rather significant sample of farmers that took up these techniques and were successful and did improve yields. And so I think it's important information. And in another study that's more recent, again looked at yield comparisons of a number of different kinds of techniques: conservation agriculture, holistic grazing management, precision agriculture, system of rice intensification, and organic agriculture. And then again, without going too much into what these different systems are, again, they're using different sets of the techniques I mentioned earlier. What this shows is that yield was either increased in these relative to conventional, or it stayed the same for the majority, about 65% in the case of conservation agriculture, up to about 95% in the case of system of rice intensification for these first four techniques. So what this means is that with these techniques that are going to do better in terms of sustainability, they're often as good or better than the conventional. So that suggests that there's definitely some positive here. What about with organic? Here we don't see very many where the yield is actually improved or the same as conventional agriculture. We have much more conventional agriculture having higher, we have many more studies in which organic agriculture showed yield gaps or yield losses compared to conventional agriculture. So what's going on with that? Well, we did a study in my lab that looked at what is that differential. And what we found by bringing all the original data together is that, yeah, there is a yield gap, but it isn't that large of a gap. So yes, often we do find that organic agriculture produces lower yields than conventional agriculture, but the amount of the yield gap is about 20%. And that would be a lot for an individual farmer. On the other hand, often farmers are going to make that up because what they care about is not yield, but profit and livelihood. And so if they can get an economic advantage through marketing organic food, then that yield differential really might not matter to them. And I think that you might be hearing from some farmers later on in the course that Carl Rosado hasn't been here yet. Right, has he been here already? Has been here. Okay, so you've already heard from Carl Rosado, and I think that that would very much be the case for that farm, for example. So the yield gap is not really that large. And a couple of interesting things, when we looked a little bit more closely, there's a wide spectrum of ways of doing organic farming. Some organic farms pretty much do monoculture farming, and other organic farms are doing intercropping, and they're doing cover cropping and rotations and all kinds of things. And what we found is that this yield gap could really be reduced, become much smaller, when the organic farms were making use of polyculture, for example, or when they were doing much more complex rotations than the conventional farms. Then that yield gap really diminished. So that shows the importance of these diversifying factors for productivity. And another really important thing is it a yield gap between organic and conventional, or is it a knowledge gap? And this is some information from several former students here at UC Berkeley, looking at the amount of the U.S. Department of Agriculture funding for research, education, and extension, how much of it goes to conventional versus organic. And here you can see it's not even 2% of the funding is going to organic. Most of it's going to conventional. And given that research gap, the knowledge gap, we could ask the question, given the huge investment in research to improve conventional agriculture, why is the differential between conventional and organic agriculture so small? Why hasn't conventional agriculture done much, much better than that, given all that research investment? If we had that research investment for organic, my belief is that we could really reduce or eliminate, or perhaps even reverse, this yield gap. So I want to talk a little bit about two examples where research is helping, where some concentrated research effort has gone forward and where it is improving the yield question. So the first one's going to be about pollinators. That's what I work on myself. So let me give you a little bit of background to start with. We now grow, of course, here in California, crops in these huge monocultures. And when we do that, it creates a very large demand for pollinators. All these blossoms here need to be visited by a bee, and when they're grown in such large arrays, really the only way we can do it is to import the European honeybee in large numbers. So each of these colonies then will have 50 to 100,000 individuals, and they'll be literally transported right out onto the farm field. In California, we bring in 1 million of these colonies every year to pollinate things like almond and sunflower and watermelon and other crops. And of course, when we're growing things in monoculture like this, they're often very susceptible to pests, so we use a lot of pesticides in these kinds of cropping systems. And one of the kinds of pesticides that has become very prevalent recently are neonicotinoid pesticides, and these are pesticides that they actually put on the seed. So these are seeds that have been coated with the neonicotinoid pesticides, and recently these pesticides have been implicated in the phenomenon of colony collapse disorder. They're not the only contributor, but they're one of probably many contributors that are synergizing to cause the loss of honeybee colonies, massive losses that you've probably heard about. And that means that now the honeybee has become sort of a weak link in the chain from field to fork. But we also have all of these native pollinators, and it's not just people that like to live here. Native pollinators also like to live in these kinds of diversified farms. And research that we've done on farms like this, like Full Belly Farm as an example, we really find native pollinators alone can provide sufficient pollination services for crops. We don't need to import honeybees when we have cropping systems like this. And we've done more detailed research that looks at specific elements, like, for example, the polyculture. The polyculture is important in improving multiple different crop types are important in improving bee diversity and abundance to provide those pollination services. We've looked at the hedgerows, and again, we find these hedgerows are really important in promoting healthy bee communities that can provide pollination services. And we've looked at the natural habitats surrounding the farm fields and how important they are in providing these pollinator communities. And going out to more of to generalize from our results, here's our studies that have contributed to this much larger global synthesis. And interestingly, in this study, we found that consistently there are increases in crop yields in response to native pollinator visits. And this is much more consistent than the increase in crop yields due to honeybees. So it turns out native pollinators around the world are being found to actually be better contributors to pollination than the managed honeybees that we import. So here is a strong case for research to identify these interactions and these interlinkages to build the case for diversified agriculture.